Welcome back. Now let us look at the first concept of this lesson, which is feeding relationships. Living organisms need to feed to be able to perform all life processes and stay alive. So in order for you to have energy to perform life processes, you need food to eat. That is where the feeding comes in. So organisms can be classified into groups according to what they eat. This helps us to determine the feeding relationships between living organisms in an ecosystem. In simple terms, it shows us which organisms we eat which organism, or which organism is being eaten by what organism. Some organisms can produce their own food, while other organisms cannot do this and need to feed on other organisms for energy. For instance, we have plants. Plants have the ability to make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Now, we also have consumers such as cows. Cows have the ability to eat producers, but they cannot make their own food. So that is what we are trying to get across. Therefore, we can identify the different feeding styles in an ecosystem based on how the organisms obtain their food. We have producers and consumers in ecosystems. So we are going to look at producers. The term producer comes from the word produce, which means to make or to manufacture from raw materials. So producers are organisms that have the ability to make their own food. These are also called autotrophs. So the word auto means self and troph means feeding. So these are organisms that have the ability to feed themselves by making their own food. So how do they do that? They do it through the process of photosynthesis. This food may be used by plants immediately during life processes, or it can be stored as starch in different parts of the plants and will later be consumed by other organisms that feed on the plant as well. Examples of producers are plants and algae. So here's a nice picture of a plant that can photosynthesize or make its own food. And then we have a nice example of an algae, which we normally find in wet areas or in aquatic ecosystems. Then we are going to start with the next concept of our lesson, which is consumers. So we have 4 different types of consumers. Now we are going to look at what consumers are. The term consumer comes from the word consume, which means to eat, to ingest, or to take something in. Therefore, consumers are organisms that only eat or have the ability to consume, but they cannot make their own food. This is the same example I made earlier about the cow. They have the ability to eat other organisms, but they cannot make their own food. So we refer to these organisms as consumers. Here is the nice cow that is consuming grass, but it cannot make its own grass. Now, consumers are also called heterotrophs. So the term hetero means other, and troph means feeding. So now it means that these are organisms that feed on other organisms. There are a number of consumers, and they can be grouped according to the food that they eat. Like I mentioned earlier, we have 4 different types of consumers, and they are all classified according to what they eat. So the first consumer that we have is a herbivore. Here's a nice picture of a herbivore. It's a giraffe that is eating leaves from a tree. And then we have carnivores. Carnivores, here is a nice picture of a carnivore that has just eaten something, because we can tell with the blood stains on the mouth. And then we have omnivores, which is human beings sitting at home and watching. Then the 4th one is decomposers. Now we are going to look at each and every one of them in details. By the way, this is a picture of decomposers. If you look closely, these are worms. Right, so we are going to look at the first consumer, which is herbivores. So the term herb means plants, and vor means to eat. So herbivores are organisms that eat plants. Examples of herbivores are cows, sparrows, elephants, locusts, and more. So here is one example of a herbivore because it eats only grass. So that means the diet is limited to herbs or plants or grass. Then we also have another herbivore here, which is the buffalo. So herbivores such as the buffalo that eat grass are called grazers. So cows, buffaloes are all grouped as grazers because they are only eating the grass. And then we have herbivores such as giraffes and kudus. These eat leaves from the trees, so we call them browsers. So here's an example of a browser or a giraffe. So we have two types of herbivores. We have grazers, which eat grass, and then we have browsers, which eat leaves from trees. So that is our first type of consumer. Now we are going to look at the next one, which is carnivores. The term carni means flesh, and vor, if you remember from the first one, is to eat. So carnivores are animals that feed on the flesh of other animals. So examples include predators. These are organisms that catch and kill their prey before eating them. So that is the first type of carnivore. It is a predator and it catches and kills its prey. So examples of predators are sharks, lions, snakes, tigers, and there's more. So here's an example of our predator, which is a shark. If you can see, it's a very angry shark, probably hunting or trying to catch a prey. Then our second type of carnivore is scavengers. Scavengers feed on dead animals and decaying meat. So the examples of scavengers that we have vultures, we have hyenas, and raccoons. So here is a nice example of a scavenger, which is a vulture. Then our last type of carnivore is insectivores. As you can hear from the first part of the word, insects. So these are carnivores that eat insects such as termites and grasshoppers. So an example of our insectivore is a swallows. Here's a nice picture. As you can see, it's a very small bird, so it eats grasshoppers and other small insects. Now we are going to move on to our third type of consumer, which is our omnivores. The term omni means all, and vor, again, still the same thing, to eat. So all eats, which means omnivores eat both animals and plants. That is what omnivores are. These are animals that feed on both plants and animals. So examples of omnivores, we have baboons, because they eat fruits, they eat roots, they eat insects and worms. So they eat both plants and animals. That is why they are a perfect example of an omnivore. Here's a nice picture over here. And then we also have human beings. Yes, you and I are an example of omnivores as well, because we eat both meat and plants, plants being our vegetables, our fruits, and everything that we eat. So we are also falling under the category of omnivores. This is an example of omnivores. Then our last type of consumers, we have decomposers. Now, decomposers are living organisms that break down the remains. So that is what decomposers do. They break down the remains of dead plants and animals into simple substances. The simpler substances are then eaten or released back into the soil. So when the decomposers break down these remains of dead animals, they consume them, and then the remaining parts are then absorbed by the soil and into the plants as nutrients. The roots of the plants will then absorb the nutrients that are decomposed matter, like I've explained earlier. Decomposers recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem. And they have different sizes. So that means we have big decomposers that we can see with our naked eyes, and we also have decomposers that we cannot see with our naked eyes. So bacteria are very small decomposers, while we have mushrooms, which are bigger decomposers. So here's a picture that shows us bacteria, and also that shows us mushrooms. So mushrooms are the more common ones that we come across every day. And we also have bacteria, which you cannot see with your naked eyes. We also have worms, which are also decomposers, and you can see with your eyes. So those are decomposers, and they are also part of consumers. Before we move on to our next concept, we are going to go on to an ad break. I'll see you after that.